Welcome back to Leaders, a podcast dedicated to exploring the best leaders this world has ever seen. On today's episode 6, we'll be exploring Henry Ford. We'll be diving back into the auto industry. If you go back to episode 4, we first covered Lee Iacocca of Ford and Chrysler fame. Now we are going to the source of Ford in the famed Henry Ford to explore not only his successes, but those key leadership styles that made him very successful in implementing Ford Motor Company, as well as other techniques that really pushed forward the entire industry. And so part of the research here was looking at two different main books. Henry Ford, I Invented the Modern Age, and My Life and Work, The Autobiography of Henry Ford. And so, starting with Henry's rise to CEO path, it is described that what he did for the 20th century, Edison did for the 19th century, and Henry Ford, in his beginnings, before he starts Ford Motor Company, we are going to dive into his particular connection to Edison and his influence that he had on Mr. Ford. And so what Henry Ford sought out to do was build the best machine possible. And in 1891, he got a job as an engineer at the Edison Aluminum Company in Detroit. He quickly rose through the ranks, and in 1896, he built his first gasoline-powered car, the quadricycle. Now, just a few years later, in 1899, he ends up leaving Thomas Edison's illuminating company to start his own company, which was Detroit Automobile Company. And that company failed after only a year, but he didn't give up. In 1903, he co-founded the Ford Motor Company, and Ford's first car for the Ford Motor Company was the Model A, but it was actually what most people know is the Model T that made him famous, and the Model T was an affordable car that was easy to operate and maintain. It was also the first car to be mass-produced on an assembly line. I feel like what few people know, and what going into this research I didn't really know too much into, was that he also starts Cadillac shortly after he starts Ford, but eventually leaves the company shortly thereafter. So in addition to Ford, he has a enduring legacy with the Cadillac brand that is still around today. And just to kind of pinpoint before we go into more of his leadership styles, there are some defining career moments in business success that we want to highlight here. So as I had mentioned before, 1896, it's the quadricycle that is really his first kind of main career moment. 1903, he then co-founds Ford Motor Company. In 1908, that is when he is introducing the Model T. And then 5 years after that is when he introduces the assembly line, which really revolutionized the way cars are made. And then in 1914, he doubles the wages of his employees to $5 a day, which at that point in time was a significant jump and really created a new standard of living for American workers, which we will go into from his leadership style and the way that he operated from a business philosophy perspective. And then finally, there's 3 here. In terms of 1927, Ford introduces the Model A, which replaces the Model T. 1932, he introduces the V8 engine, which becomes the standard engine in Ford cars. And then finally, in 1937, Ford Motor Company is the first major American company to recognize the United Auto Workers Union. And so let's go into what Ford was known for from a leadership sense here in terms of his styles. So one of the most notable ones was his focus on efficiency. And being in the manufacturing business, he was obsessed with finding ways to reduce costs and increase productivity. And that led him to develop the assembly line. He was also a strong believer in treating his employees well. He raised wages and instituted an 8-hour workday, which were both radical ideas at the time. And that's just kind of interesting to take a look back at something in terms of the 8-hour workday that to this day is, deemed the norm and the standard. And really that was the origins of it were from Ford, and whether it be manufacturing or not, it is kind of the standard way of looking at a working business day, if you will, in most industries, I would say. So just interesting that hasn't really evolved too much from how he first implemented it in car manufacturing. But along with that, he also created a company culture that emphasized teamwork and cooperation. On the other hand, he was also autocratic and dictatorial. He was known for his temper and his willingness to fire employees who didn't meet his expectations. So he also had a strong dislike of labor unions, which he eventually comes around to, but initially was very not in favor of. And so a lot of those leadership traits are bucketed into one. So it's interesting to look at a combination of dictatorial, service, and visionary leadership, and something where he transformed, I think, initially of being a autocratic, dictatorial sense leader into more of a participatory, high-quality leader, member exchange-based leadership style that then had an effect on the company. So Ford didn't necessarily have outright success from the get-go. He really had to transform as a leader, and then that transformation as a leader then transformed itself into his companies, and his first even company before Ford failed. So he had to kind of adapt a little bit of that, and he kind of has a combination then of an interesting way of like a coercive and affiliative kind of qualities. So coercive meaning, he demanded really immediate compliance to what he outlined in terms of how cars are made, how to do things, that sort of thing. So he didn't really stand for imperfect work or lazy employees. He is kind of quoted in saying that humans are innately, wired to work. So that was his expectation. And his factories were mostly described as stressful and strictly structured. And the workforce was mechanicalistically organized, and everyone had a specific place. So that style of leadership conflicts with America's low power distance status, but at the time, he seemed to be able to make it successful. So he's able to retain those employees that he was, on one end, hard with, but then also knew that those workers were the kind of engine behind his company. So he valued those workers. He paid them well as a result of that, and then created shorter work days and developed employee loyalty and satisfaction as a result of that. In terms of being a transformative leader, he was also a visionary leader. So he had a clear vision for the future of the automotive industry, and he saw that cars could be made affordable for the average person. So he worked really tirelessly to make the singular vision, as well as make that singular vision a reality. And he's quoted in saying that quality means doing it right when no one is looking. And the only way to do great work is to love what you do. And loving what you do really hones in on Ford's driven nature. So he was incredibly driven and focused. He wasn't really afraid to take risks or to challenge the status quo. He was also willing to put in long hours and hard work to achieve his goals. And a few quotes that really drive that home, I think, are "thinking is the hardest work there is," which is probably the reason so few people engage in it. the only thing worse than starting something and failing is not starting something. So the leadership style drove his ability to be comfortable with the fact that what he was really developing from an auto industry perspective was innovation and change. And so he was very comfortable with that setting. And at the same time, as I alluded to, he was very empathetic with his employees. So he understood the importance of treating his employees well. And so he raised wages, instituted an 8-hour workday, and then created a company culture that emphasized teamwork and cooperation. And he's quoted in saying, "Coming together is a beginning. Keeping together is progress. Working together is success. And the only real mistake is the one from which we learn nothing." And finally, from a leadership style and traits perspective, he was innovative. So he was always looking for new ways to improve his products and business. And he was a pioneer in the use of assembly lines in mass production and was always open to new ideas. And he's always quoted in saying, "Don't find fault, find a remedy." And a few other business principles. So he lists out 4 specific business principles that he drove home in terms of these leadership styles and traits, I would say. And so the first one being the absence of fear of the future, a disregard of competition, the putting of service before profit, and finally, buying materials fairly and then transforming them into the smallest amount of cost to consumer. So he was obsessive around the cost control and getting out the lowest cost manufactured automobile that there was. And so he wanted complete control in regards to the ability to do that. And so in episode 1, if we look back on Jim Senegal, he has an obsessive nature around cost in terms of Costco and their ability to supply and source the lowest possible goods that they're available in their warehouses to pass on those savings to the customers. And so Henry Ford, similarly here, really implements that the low cost of the cars is not going to be a detriment in terms of how it's viewed from the consumer. It's more about the maximum amount of consumers being able to consume and or kind of buy that product. So some key similarities there. And so that will round out kind of leadership style and traits from Henry Ford. We're now going to get into a little bit of the failures that he encountered throughout his career as well. And so as I alluded to earlier, before he starts Ford Motor Company, he actually starts Detroit Automobile Company, and that is going to be his first attempt at starting an automobile company, and that failed after only a year and a half. The company was unable to turn a profit, and he was forced to sell his shares in that. That wouldn't be the only company that he would try to start from an automobile perspective that failed. So again, his second attempt at that is the Henry Ford Company. And so this time his company was dissolved after only 2 years. And again, he was forced to sell his shares. And while the Model T was very successful and Ford's most successful car, could be deemed as the most controversial. So the car was designed to be affordable for the average person, but it was also very basic and utilitarian. So that led to some criticism that Ford was producing sort of a one-class car that was not appealing to everyone. And he, really standardized that process of the manufacturing as well as the look and feel of the Model T car. So, some criticism there as to that uniformity. The final one here is the Battle of the Oberpass. So in 1937, Ford refused to recognize the United Auto Workers Labor Union, and that led to a strike. So on May 26th, Ford's service department attacked labor organizers on a pedestrian overpass at Ford's Rogue plant. This event, known as the Battle of the Overpass, became a lasting symbol of the American labor struggle. So just kind of a one-off event that, signifies labor conditions, workers, employees, and that kind of constant battle that you see within the manufacturing industry there. The next and final section here that I'm going to go into detail is on the mentors and heroes section. And for Henry Ford, we are going to break this up into two different distinct sections. The first being mentors. So specific to mentorship, Thomas Edison, I think, is the first person to bring up here. And Ford met Edison in 1896 and became a close friend and employee. Edison was a major influence on Ford's thinking, and Ford credited him with teaching him the importance of hard work, innovation, and efficiency. And so Henry worked at Thomas Edison's illuminating company, and while he worked there, he was frequently encouraged by Edison himself to tinker on the side with internal combustion engines. And so it's this kind of nudge and this encouragement, I would say, from Edison, which takes a special kind of person to sort of inspire and encourage this type of behavior, in that Henry is working along with Edison at the company, but then he's also encouraging him to kind of pursue his side interest in engines and automobiles, that eventually Ford realizes that that's where his passion really lies, and eventually leaves the company. So just looking out for the best of Mr. Ford, and realizing that too is really special, I would say, in terms of their relationship. And another mentor that Henry Ford alludes to in his books as well is James F. Couzens. So Couzens was the Ford's first business partner and the first president of the Ford Motor Company. And he was a brilliant businessman who helped Ford to turn his vision into an affordable car into a reality. And so he was considered Ford's greatest asset. And Couzens believed in the company so much that he ended up putting his entire life savings into Ford, which at that time was $400, and that ends up being paid off handsomely. That $400 ends up being turned into $30 million at the end of the day. So a tremendous investment with that. And really what Couzens, in addition to being a business partner and helping to run Ford, he was credited with being able to scale and keep Ford shipping cars. So he made sure cars got out of the door. Ford was renowned for being a perfectionist. So if it were just up to Ford, really, I'm not sure if we would have seen the success that the Model T or some of the other versions of Ford's motor company's cars were able to put out, simply because Ford may have not let them get out quick enough. And so is this push from Couzens to ensure that there was efficiency and that the consumers eventually got hold of the product. Another mentor and final mentor I'm going to mention here is Albert Kahn. And so Kahn was an architect who designed many of Ford's factories, including the Rouge plant that was mentioned earlier. And he was a master of industrial design. His work helped to make Ford Motor Company one of the most efficient and productive companies in the world. So the infrastructure backbone behind a lot of the factories that ended up making it, Albert was a key figure in making that happen. And so he was a mentor considered with Henry Ford. And in addition to that, as far as mentors, there's also some heroes that Henry Ford mentions too. So Ford admired Abraham Lincoln as well. So he admired him for his leadership during the Civil War and his commitment to equality. He also mentioned Ralph Waldo Emerson, and Emerson was a philosopher who influenced Ford's thinking on the importance of individualism and self-reliance. So Ford definitely points to the importance of self-reliance and really gets a lot of influence from Emerson there. And then finally, Leo Tolstoy. So Tolstoy was a Russian novelist who influenced Ford's thinking on the importance of simplicity and social justice. And so with that, a quick episode today on Henry Ford. Probably could have gotten into a little bit more detail, but I really wanted to drive home the main points from a leadership end that he exemplified. And that being focus on efficiency, I think a very unique mix of initially a very put-off kind of dictatorial managerial style, and that evolved over time and was really transformed into being a highly effective leader that had kind of empathy towards the employees, knowing that he highly valued those employees and the work that they were able to put out. And so Henry Ford, a seminal figure within the auto industry, and not only should be studied from a business principle standpoint and everything that he was able to do to revolutionize the industry as a whole, but also the way that he was able to do that and start Ford Motor Company and persist through starting multiple motor companies before that, and really some of these business principles and really having a vision and transforming the world as a result of it. So with that, that is episode 6 on Henry Ford, and hopefully we'll be back for episode 7 soon. Thanks.